Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel on making experimentation work at scale. I'm Henry Jewkes, the experimentation architect at Split, and I'm joined today by head of data science at LinkedIn and an author of Trustworthy Online Experiments, Controlled Experiments. And also with us is Lukas, the director of experimentation at Booking.com. Today, we'll be discussing core concepts in experimentation and how each of our guests have built strong experimentation cultures within their organizations. Welcome, and Lukas.
Great to be here.
It's great to be here, yeah.
Great to have you. So just to dive right in. So Lukas, when you introduce a new employee to running experiments, what are the essential things that they need to know to get started? What are the biggest mistakes that you see those new to experimentation making?
Oof. So we have a standardized curriculum for people to follow when they join. So we give them some training, explain the scientific method, explain to them how to use the tool, how to interpret the statistics, etc. It's very light on the statistics itself. It's mostly about the workflow and the procedures and more of the scientific method than it is about the statistics. And you asked about mistakes, but I think not so much a mistake, but more of a misconception is that when most people come new and fresh to experimentation, they magically expect their first idea to work because they've never actually seen any evidence to the contrary. They're used to building something, rolling it out, huge success. And so when you start experimenting for the first time, you often realize that not every idea works just as well as you thought it would. And so it's difficult to come to terms with, but it's important.
Sure. And so that idea of something working, right? In the first chapter of Trustworthy Online Controlled Experiments, you define some key experimentation concepts, and one of those is the overall evaluation criteria. Can you describe a bit more what that is and why it's helpful to define success?
Well, if you cannot define what the success is, you ended up going to be building the wrong things, right? So, or when you are deciding which one you should be shipping, you'll be shipping the wrong things. So a lot of times I would say even more important than building out infrastructure is to first define what the goal is and whenever for your company overall, right? And then over OEC, the overall evaluation criteria, is really just how you would then measure each experiment towards those bigger company goals specifically. And like, let's just take a very simple example that your company may have. If you are a search company, you may have your success criteria to be revenue and maybe how many queries that people are searching. But if you are purely just using those two metrics in your experimentation, you may actually realize that sometimes they can maybe go in conflict with each other, and sometimes they would be not necessarily reflecting that the user of the search engine is actually getting benefit, because you could have people searching and searching over and over again, not necessarily finding what they're looking for. You get a lot of queries, which is not necessarily a good thing. So again, overall evaluation criteria is really as simple as possible. Ideally, you have one metric. It can be a weighted metric, and sometimes it's a suite of metric that you're using to really track and evaluate whether this experiment is successful and should be launched or not.
Now, when you're doing this measurement, right, you run the experiment and you're collecting all this data. The one of the key concepts that our customers find essential is proper randomization of the data, making sure that the samples that you're working with are effectively randomized to build a good controlled experiment. In your book, you say proper randomization is critical. If the experimental design assigns an equal percentage of users to each variant, then each user should have an equal chance of being assigned to each variant. Do not take randomization lightly. So, what are the keys to success and common misconceptions around randomization?
So first of all, I fully wanted to agree and emphasizing the fact that getting randomization right is so critical, because a lot of the mistakes that we've seen tactically to execute the experimentation is the randomization phase is wrong, right? And then now if you're coming back to the power of controlled experiments, it really comes from the randomization, because randomization is the way in controlled experiments to remove the biases, to remove the adoption bias, selection bias, and removing the intrinsic differences between users who get randomized into treatment or randomized into control. So coming to misconception, and actually, I would actually highlight one thing that you mentioned. I'm picking up is you mentioned about like users needs to have equal chance to get randomized into treatment and control. That is, you are assuming that the treatment and control actually have to be equal sized. Yeah. And the truth is that the treatment and control doesn't need to be equal sized. There are, and we actually go into pretty much length about that. There are benefit of having them to be equal sized. As a matter of fact, if you have 100 people, you put 50 in treatment, 50 in control, that is going to give you the maximum power when you are analyzing the experiments. And then also there are a lot more complicated technical reasons. Let's say if you are having cache and that you wanted to make sure that the cache is the same size between treatment and control. So sometimes by having the equal size treatment and control arms, you will naturally get those, but it's not a prerequisite. As a matter of fact, many of the experiments that we run at LinkedIn, they are actually not equal sized. And to the extent of when let's say you have 100 user, you don't want it to start your experiment just by running 50-50, right? Because then what if there's some issue in the experiment, in the new treatment? So you want it to actually start like a smaller percentage for your treatment, and then kind of moving up. And we talk about it in sort of this ramping up of phase approach in one of the chapters in the book as well.
Sure. Yeah. And when you're trying to validate that the experiment is working, is doing what you're intending it to do, obviously we have the concept of guardrail metrics to make sure that your user base is reacting appropriately. But there's also a concept of kind of guardrails of the experiment. Is there something that you could measure to validate that this randomization is actually working the way that you're expecting it to?
Lukas, do you want to take that first? I think it's actually a very common approach that we do across the board.
I hope the sample ratio mismatch test made it into your book. So there's actually quite a relatively straightforward test called a sample ratio mismatch test. The mismatch here is between what was expected and what was observed. And the ratio refers to the ratio between the treatment and the control. So if we talk about a 50-50 split, that's a ratio of 1 to 1. If we then observe, or imagine that's the configuration of the experiment, and we then observe in the data that the ratio is actually 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 even, then that's a mismatch between our expectation and our observation. And in that case, we would conclude that there's likely a problem either with the randomization or that there's data missing. For example, we have an entire paper together with Alexander Fabian about this. But there's many different reasons why things can go wrong. And the nice thing about the sample ratio mismatch is that it's a very simple test that captures a lot of different things that could go wrong. And so I always recommend that people perform this test. And to Ya's earlier point, this is about the expectation, not about an equal split. So if you set up a test to be 80-20, you expect 4 to 1, then you would be surprised by a 1 to 1. So in that case, if you observe an equal split, that would not be good because that's not what you wanted. That's not what you configured. And so the sample ratio mismatch test takes this into account and simply compares what was expected against what was observed.
Yeah.
When you get that result back from a sample ratio mismatch, you identify that a mismatch exists. We have that check inside of Split, but then we are always engaging with customers to kind of walk through the steps of how you identify what might be going wrong, or whether it's data collection or actually something about user behavior that's impacting that data.
Yeah, this is the tricky thing about the sample ratio mismatch test. It tells you that something is wrong, but it doesn't tell you what is wrong. And actually finding the root cause of the sample ratio mismatch can be quite complicated, because sometimes it could be something related to the platform, that there's something about the platform that's causing this thing to happen. But it could also be something about the treatment. So something that you're doing in this experiment is actually causing the SRM. And so it's very difficult sometimes to identify what is the real cause in this particular case.
And I just wanted to add one more thing, which we find it super productive in terms of diagnosing why is there a sample size ratio mismatch. We actually, over the many years, we have identified many root causes, and a lot of them are actually quite common. So what we do is we actually build all this into a little tool, like we call like sample size ratio mismatch clinic. So teams who saw that they have a sample size ratio mismatch can just like click a button and run this tool, and it gives you a little like automated report on like, hey, like this can be the reason. And then a lot of times, because the sample size ratio mismatch is actually caused by the sort of the how they set up the test, and the domain knowledge is important in that. So combination of the domain knowledge and the expertise that you get by running that tool is a super effective way.
That's super cool.
Yeah. So just adding one more thing that Lukas mentioned, I think this ratio super effective, help us identify, I want to say easily like 90% of the issues when people set up the test wrong. And I just wanted to highlight like the importance of having this test run like done properly, because there were cases when we didn't have a platform many years ago. People would do their own ratio, right? They're like, oh, you know, I expect 50-50, so 1-to-1, and then I'm seeing a ratio of 1.001. That's good enough.
It's fine.
Yeah, but it's not. Like, you know, that's why, like, you know, Henry, you mentioned about how Split has this functionality, like, because there is, you gotta have to have the proper, you know, hypothesis test to say, hey, is 1.001 actually statistically significantly different from 1 or not, right? So making sure that is done properly. So the second thing I would add is there are some the second most effective approach, maybe a little harder to do than sample size ratio mismatch, is this thing called AA test, right? So you know, the ratio is sort of the first sniff test, and then the second is, you know, a lot of the times, did you randomize you know, users evenly into the two arms into the two variants, by checking if there's any pre-existing differences between those two buckets of users before you even start running the experiment, can reveal a lot as well.
Yeah. And so, you know, you've talked about how this takes, you know, effectively that domain knowledge and helps to kind of, you know, work with end users of the platform to run effective experiments and look for issues. Another thing that we look at as, you know, kind of subject matter experts working with the broader team is how you kind of share the lessons that you're learning through experimentation within the organization. So Lukas, at Booking.com, you know, how do you work through that process of you know, reporting? You know, you reported kind of at the beginning that you might run your first experiment and, you know, the experiment fails to improve what you were trying to change. How do you help the team, you know, learn from that, know that it's expected, and then stay positive through that learning process?
Oh, wow. Okay. It's a lot of questions in one. I think one thing to think about is that, and this took me a while to get sort of to grips with, but initially I was thinking of experimentation as sort of a data science type exercise. And over the years, I started to realize that actually a platform like the one that I'm responsible for is more a workflow tool than anything else. We have a scientific method. This is a workflow that a user must go through. And so we view our platform as a guiding hand to help people go through that workflow. And obviously data science and statistics is part of the workflow, but things like defining a clear hypothesis up front, picking metrics that make sense, picking relative or relevant effect sizes, and doing power calculations. These are all parts of a workflow, of a step-by-step process that we have to guide a user through. And so we tried to build a platform with that mindset, where we try to elicit from users exactly the kind of answers to the questions that they need to be answering before we can even run the test to get really meaningful results at the end. I think often when users say, well, I learned nothing from this test, it's because they didn't spend enough time thinking about what the test was supposed to do in the first place and how they were going to measure it. And so we try to help users make sure that we go through all of the steps that are required. I think the other half of your question was how do you then make sure that people actually learn from their tests, even if they're not successful? And I think this is really more around trying to help people understand that the objective is not to ship, that to put something in production is too low of a bar, that what we actually want is to help users, and that the intent of the test is to show that we have helped them. And so we try to sort of frame experimentation and frame the experiments in this context and say, well, you were successful at not harming more users with your stupid test. Well, obviously, we put it in nicer words. but this is sort of the context that you're trying to give people, that you say, well, you're not a failure because you didn't ship. You're a success because you managed to learn something.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and I would almost like correct the term to say the experiment is not successful. The experiment is always successful unless you run the experiment wrong, right? Like unless you have some issues with your experiment. The one that is not successful, maybe your idea is not successful, right? Like so I think it's a very like
again, the execution of the idea.
Exactly.
Right? An amazing idea. It's just that the execution is off.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think, going to Lukas's point of like the experimentation is a learning tool for you, right? So not that the experiment itself failed.
Yeah. And I love that idea of thinking of experiments and the tooling around it as that workflow, as that process. Yeah. And then, something that we've also been talking about inside of Split is this idea of then becoming almost a system of record, this institutional knowledge of what you've run in the past, and what you can use that to inform the future. So, how I know both of your teams have been running experiments for quite some time now, but as maybe you're onboarding new people or as you were initially introducing experimentation to the team, how did you see the overall workflow change? How did releases change through the addition of experimentation? I guess Lukas, if you want to start.
I think it's not so much that the workflow changes, is that the mindset needs to change. I think a lot of people, again, come into this thinking shipping is success. And then once you start measuring, you realize that that's not the case. And that requires a workflow change more than anything. If there's anything about shipping that changes, is that people need to be more comfortable rolling stuff back. Right? But other than that, I don't think the workflow changed that much.
John, for you?
I would plus one on that one. I think it's really to the extent of, if I can overly simplify how that has shifted over the years at LinkedIn is, it started out by telling everyone that you needed to run experiment, and then to the point that when everybody wanted to run experiment, we wanted to make sure that it's an efficient process for them, and then to the point where you actually, not only that you wanted people to run experiment and shipping things, you actually tell them, hey, let's make sure that you actually ramp things down if it's not working as you expected. And I think it's like, but overall, it's more of a mindset change than the process itself.
The most painful way that happens for us is if we have new hires that for the first time run into our automated stopping system. So we have automated stops in place where if something is really bad, we automatically terminate it. And once every while, there's a new developer who tries to start something more than once after it's stopped automatically. You sort of have to tap them on the shoulder and go, like, you realize that this is being stopped for a reason, right? Yeah. No, but I know my code works. Well, but production says it doesn't. So,
Yeah, we as we kind of speak with customers who are onboarding onto experimentation, there's almost a fear, a thought process up front of like, well, I don't want to spend all this time writing some code and then not ship it because the experiment says that it didn't work. But it's like, but do you really want to ship things that don't work? And I think
because then you have all of the upfront cost and all of the maintenance that you have to do afterwards, right? So you're just making it worse.
Yeah. And it also, I think, over time gets you more in that agile mindset of, well, let's minimize the upfront cost of what I'm building, of how much I'm investing, without knowing if it's going to be successful or not.
I think the thing, conceptually, the thing I like the most is that it puts so much emphasis on the customer experience. because it's easy for, especially for technical people, to sort of think about shipping as success and then forgetting about all of those people who actually have to use the product. And if you put experimentation in place, you force everyone to think about the impact that they're having on the customer. I think really putting the customer at the center of the product.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And also, like, I would encourage everyone to ask, or every developer who is developing this, like, asking themselves the hard question, as in, hey, you know what? If this ends up having like no benefit to the user, like, is it still worth shipping? Like, and in some cases it is, right? Like, maybe you're refactoring the code, you actually want it to be like, you know, from like comparable to the previous version. Like, but just ask that yourself, the hard question, before you even started running that experiment.
Yeah, we even have tests where if people want something to be comparable, we allow them to say, well, to what extent are you willing to take a loss? And so there, it gets very, very real, right? Because as a developer, you essentially have to say, well, this is so important, I'm willing to lose how much, right? And then you really see like how badly people want to ship something.
I love that. And then I guess last question would be organizationally. You talked about kind of key tenets and key technical requirements for organizations that wish to run online controlled experiments. What should folks be considering when they want to start implementing experimentation? Where do they need to be as an organization, as a company?
I can maybe just say maybe just two things, and that really is important. Number one, like we touched on earlier already, which is like, well, how does your company evaluate success? And like, I think starting from there, like, are you willing to be measured in that way, right? Because you know, I think that's the hardest thing. Like, experimentation, we talk about it as a part of the workflow, part of learning process, and then part of the measurement is, you know, you cannot measure if you don't have a success in mind of what that means. And so I, you know what, I'm gonna stop there, because I think that is the number one most important thing.
Lukas, anything that comes to mind? I
think Yaa touched upon it, but I want to point it out, is that the willingness to be wrong doesn't come natural to everyone.
Sure.
And you do need that. You need to be willing to admit that you were wrong, and know that is not failure, right? That being wrong is not a mistake. That is just a normal part of figuring out how to help customers. And that to get to a better product, you actually have to be wrong every once in a while. And I think that has to go all the way to the top. So I think at the highest levels in an organization, you have to have people who are willing to say, well, I thought that was going to work, but I was wrong. I think that willingness to be corrected is at the heart of this thing.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that the running an experiment doesn't change whether you're wrong or not. It gives you the information to know that
you were wrong already.
Yeah.
It's not now you have an opportunity to correct it.
Exactly. Well, I'd love to continue this discussion for another hour. We've sadly reached the end of our time. Thank you, Yaa and Lukas, for joining us today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
It's great.